Our next speaker is Professor John Jackson, who has been Director and Associate Professor Emeritus of the Black Studies and Religion Department at Denison. Dr. Jackson received his BS from Miles College, his Master of Divinity from Harvard Divinity School, and his PhD from the Ohio State University. While at Denison, he has been former Dean of the Chapel and was Associate Dean when he was hired under David Woodyard. He directed the Center for Black Studies for over 25 years. He served as a multicultural research consultant and workshop facilitator at a number of colleges and universities such as Ohio State, University of Toledo, Antioch, Occidental, Nebraska Wesleyan, Oberlin, Loyola College of Maryland, Georgetown University, and New Mexico State University. He and fellow faculty member Dr. Tony King collaborated on a chapter in the Critical Black Studies Reader, Chapter 7, I read, and was a very interesting and complicated article. And for over 10 years, John has served as a staff member of the Great Lakes College Association's Summer Multicultural Course Design and Teaching Workshops. And in 1973, he was invited to teach a section on American Black religion at the National Council of Black Studies Summer Institute. He has a long history, but he's been an active professor of religion and Black studies here at Denison. I'm going to introduce John and let him get started because he has a big history with the Black Student Union.
Thanks, Judy. I didn't say this, Judy, earlier, but it might have been a mistake to have back-to-back deans of chapel. I've been given 20 minutes, but I'm sure I'll take more. I have been given the daunting task of offering my assessment of the progress Denison has made in the area of diversity over the last 50 years. I say daunting because, well, we can't do that in 20 minutes. And much that is good and bad has happened over the course of those years, most of which I will be unable to discuss today. And yes, I'll try my best to give a balanced view, although assessments rarely come that way. I say daunting also because over the course of the last 50 years, the nomenclature of diversity has changed again and again. And the changes took place within the context of a dynamic where proponents continually sought to clarify what they were asking for, and where receiving institutions continually sought to clarify what they were willing or were able to give. History has demonstrated that there is an inevitable mismatch between what is requested and what is eventually received. This dynamic is reflected in the frequently volatile contestations and transitions between words such as integration, desegregation, cultural pluralism, multiculturalism, globalism, post-colonialism, domestic diversity, affirmative action, diversity and inclusion, non-binary thinking, feminism, intersectionality, and anti-racism. These overlapping transitions only serve to highlight the social problems to which the aforementioned social projects endeavor to respond, such as prejudice, discrimination, sexism, misogyny, classism, white supremacy, nationalism, homophobia, and xenophobia. Assessment of progress over the last 50 years becomes much like comparing apples to oranges, because progressive goals of advancing groups change, as well as institutional responses to them. What I've decided to do then are three things. First, let me acknowledge what has been emphasized by Daryl and Dave in their presentations. Were it not for the Black student activists, that is, their courage and vision exemplified in the Black student demands, we would not be where we are today. Were it not for you who supported them, we would not be here today. As it is, progress has been made, but it has often been stymied by outside forces or truncated because of institutional recalcitrance. Secondly, my objective is to take a bird's eye view in looking at trends and sampling institutional initiatives and programs, commenting upon their successes and failures. Thirdly, I do not intend to single out any one campus presidential administration as being the best, except for this one, Adam. The best or the worst. In fact, there is a tendency to credit or blame the president for everything that happens on his or her watch, when in actuality, it is sometimes the peculiar circumstances or the vision and ingenuity of grassroots activists, along with partnerships between and among all diversity actors, or some combination of all of these factors that bring about change on college campuses. Where there is always a kind of regressive inertia that slows true progress down. Were the Black demands met at Denison? Let me get to that question right away. The simple answer is both yes and no. Yes, the quantitative demands were met. Not within the prescribed immediate time frame insisted upon by the student activists, as Daryl and Dave have intimated, but yes, within relatively short order. That is, within the glacial rate at which change normally transpires in institutional settings and on university campuses. Within a decade or so, the demands were mostly met. I say mostly met. Yes, the numbers of African American faculty began to increase almost immediately. Not tenured, not always full-time, but academic appointments were made, and Black studies curricula began to flourish. To be more specific and chronological, when I arrived on campus as a young administrator and faculty member to work as a chaplain and to teach Black religion in 1974, 6 African American faculty members already had been teaching here for a couple of years or more. Most, of course, were not full-time hires. I could talk about each of them since I met and interacted with each of them, but I won't do that right now, maybe in the question and answer period. In 1976, 4 other young Black faculty members were hired on tenure track as assistant professors with specialties in Black Lit, Black psychology, Black politics, Black economics. Only 2 of these made it through Denison's rigorous tenure review process, but 1 left Denison to become a distinguished professor at Berkeley, became chair of the board of Amnesty International, for a time held a post at the U.S. State Department, then returned to Denison many years later to be awarded one of the college's prestigious honorary degrees. 2 of that group climbed the professorial ranks, became high-level administrators, and are now emeriti faculty from the University of Virginia and the Ohio State University, respectively. In 1976, African-American professionals were appointed to positions in academic services, student life, and admissions. Another Black administrator was already here as director of purchasing. Although the raw numbers have varied over the years, with Black faculty and staff coming and going, as of 2022, Denison can boast a Black caucus membership of approximately 26 members. This number sounds impressive, but only 6 will continue into the next year as full-time tenured faculty members. Unfortunately, over the years, the numbers of Black teaching faculty members have remained relatively low, somewhat in flux, as specific individual faculty members were either not tenured or left on their own accord. But by other measures, the actual percentage of Black tenured faculty have remained relatively constant. 4 to 7 tenured faculty members have been here probably since the 1980s. Even though the total number of teaching faculty has grown markedly over the years, that is the total number of teaching faculty members at Denison from 150 during the early 90s to approximately 237 or so today. So you see the percentage really has in fact gone down. We talk about there being 2.5% of African American faculty, 3.5% of faculty of color, when the national average actually is 7.9. Aside from African Americans and African descendant peoples, the college has been more successful in hiring and retaining other faculty of color and international faculty. In fact, Black Studies faculty fought for this change. FOSIF, a support group for international faculty and faculty of color, has approximately 80 members. Not all of these are tenure-track or tenured faculty members, but as you can see, Black faculty make up a tiny percentage of that total number, which itself is an undercount since some international faculty members choose not to join this organization. In raw numbers, Black student enrollment has increased markedly over the years. When I first arrived at Denison in 1974, there were less than 30 Black students. By 1976, that number had more than doubled. But from 1988 up through 1998 or so, the number hovered between 85 and 95 students. By the end of 2001, there were 110 Black students on campus. In the last few years, that number has fluctuated between 138 and 157. What the Black student movement was successful in doing in the late 1960s and early 70s was to demand increased numbers. Although these demands were usually for the hiring of more Black faculty and staff, the recruitment of more Black students, and the establishment of Black studies departments and programs, what resulted was an increased consciousness about the importance of diversity in higher education. And a flurry of new diversity hires, task forces, and campus initiatives began to proliferate in American higher education. The mad scramble to put in place some initiatives, almost anything that would appease the masses, usually followed a student protest in response to a racial incident on campus or the heating up of racial trauma in the broader society, such as the Posse Supreme Court decision in June 1978, or the Rodney King incident of 1991, and most recently the May 2020 police killing of George Floyd. As a consequence, from the 1990s on, there was an explosion of new interdisciplinary academic centers and completely new hybrid majors that continue in every segment of academe today, from two-year junior colleges to major research universities. One report indicated that Native American and Latinx groups doubled. LGBT groups tripled. And at many universities, diversity went from being a voluntary extracurricular option to an involuntary curricular requirement, as numbers of peoples of color and international student and faculty representation rapidly multiplied. At Denison, the surge in faculty of color and international faculty hiring was due in large part to the administration's decision during that time to fund a special hiring project to increase faculty diversity in 2007, following a major campus uprising here, led by students in response to what became widely known on campus as the noose incident. White students used a symbol of a noose to advertise an upcoming campus concert with the words, "Come hang out with us." Incidents of these sorts, generated by white student insensitivity to Black students in their midst, occurred year after year on predominantly white college and university campuses, including, of course, at Denison. Each time Black students protest, joined by sympathetic white students and faculty, the students of color joined with other students, clamored for increased numbers. In the year 2000, Denison's Board of Trustees and President sought to get ahead of the curve by joining the very successful National Posse Program. Touted as a student leadership program for underrepresented students of color, the Posse Program came with a highly structured mentoring formula and support system, and boasted a 90% graduation rate for its matriculants. It allowed Denison to enroll a cohort of 10, mostly students of color from Chicago each year. Several years later, a Boston Posse cohort was added, assuring the college of a total of 20 fresh recruits of color entering with the class of first-year students every fall semester. In any given four-year period, one could be assured of 80 students of color on campus. Suddenly, it became easy to surpass the benchmark of 100 African-American students demanded by the BSU activists so many years ago and embraced by President Bob Good as an indication that the college was serious about attaining and sustaining a critical mass of black students. The Posse Program became very successful at Denison, producing student leaders, attracting other students of color to the campus and incoming classes, maintaining a 90% graduation rate here as elsewhere, and transforming significant aspects of college culture here on campus. However, in 2017, due to rising costs, Denison ended its participation in the Posse Program, but replaced it with the self-designed Columbus Alliance that would enroll a similar number of matriculants of color each year. Having been underway for a relatively short period of time, been perhaps delayed a bit by the pandemic, it is yet to be seen if this bold experiment will replicate the Posse Program's success. I began my talk by commenting upon the importance of nomenclature. Let me conclude in the same way. What shall we call our efforts to diversify our campus? It is, in fact, an effort that is laudable, but is it simply to add diversity, to increase numbers from those groups that are statistically underrepresented here, as would be the case on any college campus in the U.S.? Or is it to build a qualitatively different kind of community? And I think Darrell made some reference to this. Numbers versus other kinds of more, I think, lasting and important cultural change, where equity reigns, where defined constituencies worry little about whether or not they belong here. To be very frank, I personally have trouble with the terminology diversity and inclusion. The term diversity seems mechanical to me, seems devoid of a certain amount of cultural soul. It invites us to count numbers without accounting for the lives, hearts, and minds that are still forced to exist on the margins, lives that feel excluded even while they are present, that feel just like one more number. And the term inclusion, included by whom? And for what purpose? In fact, who are the ones who are doing the including? Are they the same old power players who have always been on top in American history? The mere idea of diversity and inclusion would seem to perpetuate a system of hierarchy that the civil rights and black power movement set out to abolish. I get it, that black student activists of the 60s and 70s demanded increased numbers, more black faces, more black bodies would eventuate in a critical mass that might help create a sense of belonging. More numbers would construct a portrait of us in our complexity and reduce the likelihood that we would continue to be viewed as a monolith. diversity and multiplicity do have some intrinsic value. They have epistemological and hermeneutic significance. That is to say, what I miss from my line of sight may be picked up by others who bring significant and different perspectives. Our composite viewing may discover new knowledge invisible to single system seeing. Let no one leave this morning concluding that I am opposed to diversity and multiplicity. There was great value in the 1960s and 70s. When black student activists demanded increased numbers of faculty and students of color. The numbers changed the composition and complexion of Denison's physical body and bodies and body politic, but they also shifted the terrain of Denison's academic and intellectual landscape. Black faculty and staff, mostly in Black studies, coalesced with white women, mostly in women's studies, and the one or two Latinas on campus to form what we call, in those days, a Human Relations Council, and began to have serious conversations about the meaning of a true liberal arts education. Out of those conversations in 1978-79 came a proposal to establish a minority studies, women's studies requirement. The Chronicle of Higher Education credited Denison with being the first institutions of higher education to establish such a requirement. Faculty diversity was surely one of the variables that created that requirement and helped to transform the curriculum of the college. But when Black students demanded the recruitment of more Black students and the hiring of more Black faculty, they were not just demanding numbers. Numbers may facilitate accountability, but they are the tangible representation of something more profound. What these students have always wanted is real cultural change. They wanted to reverse centuries of exclusion and marginalization sustained by power and privilege. Diversity and inclusion falls short. We need a new language. Diversity and inclusion keeps us counting numbers in the community and do not allow us to account for quality of community. We need new language and new imagery. I am fascinated by Frederick Douglass's initiative and invitation to white abolitionists in his 1945 autobiography to hear and listen to the Black spirituals in a new way. Rather than hearing them as simple religious music, Douglass said that every tone was a testimonial against slavery. In order to fully interpret and understand the spirituals, Douglass said it was necessary to participate in the inner world of the slave and employ their own cultural and self-understanding. I want to make a pitch for bringing back the term multicultural. When one images Douglass's invitation even further, it offers a vision of a new communalism, where we meet each other within the context of our own cultural subjectivities. I'm calling this a kind of ethno-empathy that ought to be our cultural agenda. At least this term multicultural, I think, is suggestive of what we're dealing with, and not just vacuous diversity entities and numbers, but multiple cultures with complex sets of values and sensibilities. I think that I'm not a big fan of the term anti-racism either, because it is too reactive and keeps us on the defensive and assumes that what we do is just to prevent the inevitable. But I'd rather us envision a new communalism, a portrait of a society in which we come together to share whom we are with the others. Diversity and multiplicity do have value, but we need to name it properly, I think. And the image that Douglas offers us is a vision of a new kind of communalism. I admit that this is a humanistic utopian vision where one does not have to live with the cynical expectation of having to one day go on a protest against one's peers who choose unwisely to use the N-word disparagingly or even in jest, or being insulted by noose symbolism or Confederate flag waving from one's fellow human beings, or Asians being coughed and sneezed upon in a fit of anti-Asian hate, or being walled out at the border and told, go back to where you come from, you do not belong here. I admit that this is somewhat of a utopian vision. But it is something that we need to aspire to as a community, to move beyond this notion of if we increase the numbers, somehow we will make everything right. The question I started with is whether or not the Black student union's demands were met by the college. The Black student demands in the 60s and 70s, it seems, in fact, in every student protest generation following was an appeal for increased numbers. But this was an outcry, as David pointed out, for a new communalism where multiple cultures come together, where equity and justice and belonging prevail. We have made very little advancement in meeting this dimension of the Black student demands, even if such progress has been at our fingertips, and even if progress has been made in reaching the numbers. Has Denison met the Black student demands? Question that was put to me. The answer to that question remains both yes and no. Thank you.
Jackson. And our last speaker is Ariel Johnson. She's a Senior Associate Director, Gifts and Records, and she's a member